Oh, for the love of. Is that what I think it is? Chief Scientist Vzek's upper appendages twitched in disbelief as the research vessel's sensors highlighted a small metallic object plummeting through Mors Prima's toxic atmosphere. Second observer NX Tally adjusted her optical sensors, all four of them focusing on the rapidly descending object. If you think it's a human emergency survival pod, then yes, that's exactly what you think it is. She paused, mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among the ZX-3, and if my readings are correct, it's occupied. Impossible. Third observer KR Thin chittered from his station. This is a Class 13 death world. The atmospheric composition alone would dissolve most known species. The temperature swings would shatter their molecular bonds. The indigenous life forms would. He trailed off, realizing his colleagues had stopped listening. The pod crashed through the canopy of carnivorous vegetation with all the grace of a drunk Florxian mammoth, bouncing off 3 different acid-resistant tree trunks before finally coming to rest in a small clearing. The impact sent a cloud of spores from the surrounding plants shooting skyward, creating an eerily beautiful but lethal purple haze. Life signs, Vzek demanded, all 6 eyes fixed on the main viewing screen. Strong and stable, NX Tally reported, sounding almost disappointed. The occupant appears to be. Oh, this is interesting. It's Dr. Ryker Zhou, xenobiologist from the human science vessel Curious Endeavor. Vzek's head tentacles curled in recognition. The same Dr. Zhou who published that controversial paper suggesting that Class 13 worlds might actually harbor beneficial medicinal compounds. The very same KR Thin confirmed. According to the pod's data feed, there was an incident involving an experimental procedure and an accidental ejection sequence. Through the ship's high-resolution cameras, they watched as the pod's hatch burst open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. A figure emerged, clad in the standard-issue survival suit, its reflective surface already beginning to dull from the caustic atmosphere. Well came a slightly distorted voice through the pod's still-functioning communication system. This is definitely going to impact my research schedule. Dr. Zhou stood, surveying the deadly landscape with what seemed to be more curiosity than fear. Though I suppose there's no better way to test my theories than first-hand experience. Is he making jokes? KR Thin asked incredulously. He does realize he's on a planet that makes most hell worlds look like luxury resorts. Vzek raised an appendage for silence, fascinated by the human's behavior. Launched the observation drones. I want every moment of this documented. Either we're about to witness a tragic but predictable death, or... He paused as they watched Zhou begin methodically unpacking survival gear from the pod, occasionally pausing to take readings of his surroundings with a handheld device, or what NX Tally prompted. Or we're about to learn why humans have that peculiar reputation for turning impossible situations into mere inconveniences. Vzek settled into his observation chair. Begin recording. Subject: human survival behaviors in Class 13 environments. Special focus on adaptive strategies and problem-solving methodologies. Below, unaware of his audience, Dr. Zhou had already started cataloging the local flora, muttering to himself about fascinating defense mechanisms as a nearby plant tried to dissolve his sample container. This is either going to be the shortest study in history, KR Thin observed, or the most enlightening one. Vzek's head tentacles writhed in agreement. Given what I know about humans, I'm betting on the latter. The violet clouds of Mors Prima churned overhead like an angry god's morning coffee, occasionally spitting globules of acid rain that left smoking craters in the metallic-looking soil. Dr. Ryker Zhou watched as one such droplet landed on a nearby leaf, only for the plant to rapidly secrete a neutralizing compound. He pulled out his datapad, barely containing his scientific excitement. Note to self: local flora has evolved acid-neutralizing capabilities. Possible applications in industrial waste management. Assuming I live long enough to publish, he ducked as a vine whipped overhead, trying to snag anything foolish enough to fly past. Additional note: plants are aggressive. Like my ex at a wedding aggressive. Above, cloaked in the upper atmosphere, the alien observation team was deploying their network of surveillance drones. The temperature will drop by approximately 80 degrees in the next hour, NX Tally reported, checking her instruments. Most species would experience immediate cellular rupture. Fascinating, Vzek commented as they watched Zhou methodically setting up thermal sensors around his crash site. He's already anticipated the temperature swing. KR Thin manipulated the drone controls, getting a better view of the human's activities. How can he possibly know? Oh, he's reading the plant life. Look how they're already beginning to fold their outer layers. Down on the surface, Ryker was conducting his inventory check with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, though admittedly never in such extreme circumstances. Right then. 3 weeks of emergency rations, water purifier that'll probably give up after the first acid rainstorm, standard med kit that assumes I'm dealing with normal injuries and not, being digested by carnivorous moss. He paused, remembering exactly how he'd ended up in this mess. The memory made him both chuckle and wince. 24 hours earlier human science vessel Curious Endeavor. I'm telling you, Captain, these readings are unprecedented. Ryker had been practically bouncing with excitement, waving his datapad like a zealous street preacher with a holy text. The biological samples from Mors Prima show adaptive capabilities that could revolutionize our understanding of extreme environment evolution. Captain Chen had given him that look, the one that said, "I respect your expertise, but please don't blow up my ship, and you want to modify the sample containment unit to replicate the exact atmospheric conditions of Mors Prima." Think about it, we could study these organisms in real time, watch how he'd trailed off, noticing the captain's increasingly skeptical expression. I've triple-checked the safety protocols. Of course, no one had accounted for the sample's ability to rapidly evolve and adapt to the containment unit's artificial environment, or its apparent ability to trigger the lab's emergency evacuation protocols, or the fact that Ryker would trip and fall into the escape pod while trying to secure his research data. Present. "At least I grabbed the right datapad," Ryker muttered, pulling up his research notes. The temperature was already dropping. He could see his breath forming crystals that sublimated instantly in the caustic air. The survival suit's temperature regulation was working overtime, its power cells draining faster than he'd like. Around him, the landscape was transforming. Plants that had been reaching for the purple sky were now rapidly contracting, their surfaces crystallizing in patterns that would make a fractalist weep. The ground itself was beginning to crack as minerals expanded and contracted, creating a symphony of geological stress that sounded suspiciously like a funeral dirge. "The human appears to be." Taking notes, Kr Thin observed incredulously from orbit. "The environment is becoming hostile enough to kill even shielded machinery, and he's conducting a scientific survey." Viazek's tentacles curled in what might have been appreciation. Perhaps that's why they survive. They never stop trying to understand, even when understanding seems futile. Or perhaps NX Tali suggested dryly, they're simply too stubborn to recognize when they should be dead. Below, Ryker was carefully collecting samples of rapidly crystallizing plant sap, humming what sounded suspiciously like "I will survive" under his breath. If MacGyver could build a particle accelerator with duct tape and paper clips, I can definitely build a shelter with. Ryker examined the emergency pod's paneling critically, what appears to be the galaxy's most expensive tin can. From their observation post, the alien research team watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as their subject began systematically dismantling his only means of protection from the environment. "He's destroying perfectly good quantum alloy plating," Kr Thin observed, his voice rising to a pitch usually reserved for witnessing particularly gruesome accidents. "Is that a rock?" Technically, NX Tali corrected, adjusting her sensors. "It's a crystallized formation of local mineral deposits that he's shaped into a primitive tool. Though why he isn't using the pod's built-in molecular reconstructor is beyond me." "Power conservation," VA Zekt mused, all 6 eyes narrowed in concentration. "He's salvaging what he can while the basic systems still function." Down on the surface, Ryker was having what he'd describe as a professionally interesting time. Scientists speak for terrifying but fascinating. He'd managed to create a basic framework using the pod's structural supports, arranging them in a geodesic pattern that would distribute the weight evenly. The real challenge was finding something to fill in the gaps. "Hello, what's this?" He crouched down to examine a patch of what appeared to be metal-like growth spreading across the ground. Either this planet has naturally occurring living metal, or he poked it with his makeshift tool. The surface rippled like mercury and began slowly climbing up the implement. Note to self: local organism shows properties similar to both metalloids and colonial organisms. Also tries to eat everything it touches. Reminds me of my college roommate. Kr Thin's monitoring equipment suddenly lit up with alerts. "He's going to die." "That's a creeping metallophage. It dissolves and absorbs any metallic substance it encounters." But Ryker had already dropped the tool and was frantically digging through his salvage supplies. He emerged with a container of emergency sealant foam, the kind usually used to patch hull breaches in space. Basic chemistry suggests he sprayed a small amount of the foam near the advancing metallophage. The creature immediately reversed direction, recoiling from the polymer-based substance. Hey, doesn't like non-metallic materials, which means... The aliens watched in disbelief as Ryker began spraying the foam in strategic patterns around his shelter framework, creating barriers that the metallophage wouldn't cross. He's using one deadly element of the environment to defend against another, V.A. Zek noted, his tentacles writhing with excitement. Speaking of deadly elements, Ryker muttered, becoming aware of a low vibration in the ground. That feels suspiciously like... The earth erupted 30 meters from his half-built shelter. A creature that looked like the unholy offspring of a terrestrial earthworm and an industrial drilling machine burst forth, its segmented body covered in rotating bands of crystalline teeth. It rose at least 5 meters into the air, sensors along its length pulsing with bioluminescent light. Well, Ryker said with forced cheerfulness, that explains all the tunnel systems I've been detecting. He slowly reached for his datapad, because some habits die harder than others even when face-to-face with what appeared to be a weaponized version of the Mongolian deathworm. The creature swayed, obviously detecting his presence. Its sensors pulsed faster. The tunneling razor fiend detects prey through seismic vibrations and electromagnetic fields, Kr Thin recited nervously. The human's electrical equipment will make him look like a glowing all-you-can-eat buffet next tally finished. Yes, we can see that. But Ryker was already moving. He threw his powered datapad as far as he could in one direction while sprinting in the other. The razor fiend, detecting the stronger electronic signature, lunged for the datapad. In that moment, Ryker did something that made the alien observers question either his sanity or their understanding of human intelligence. He ran straight for the metallophage patch. Is he committing suicide? Kr Thin wondered aloud. The razor fiend, realizing it had been tricked, whirled with surprising speed. It surged after Ryker, its crystalline teeth whirling like thousands of diamond-tipped drill bits. Ryker waited until the last possible moment before diving aside. The massive creature, unable to turn as quickly, plowed straight into the metallophage colony. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The metallophage surged up the razor fiend's metallic crystal body, causing the creature to thrash in panic. Within moments, it retreated back into its tunnel, leaving behind a significantly expanded and well-fed metallophage colony. How Ryker said, picking himself up and dusting off his suit. Guess I found my security system. He retrieved his datapad, which had surprisingly survived its role as bait. Note to self: local apex predator can be deterred by intelligent use of smaller predators. Also update resume to include successfully weaponized hostile alien life forms against other hostile alien life forms. Back in orbit, the observation team sat in stunned silence. Did he just? Kr Thin started. Turn one deadly species against another while simultaneously solving his perimeter defense problems? V.A. Zek finished. Yes, he did. And now he's gone right back to construction, NX Tally observed, her tone caught between exasperation and admiration. Using the razor fiend's tunnel as a guide for where not to build, I might add. Indeed, Ryker had returned to his work with renewed vigor, now equipped with both a better understanding of local threats and a natural barrier system. He began humming again as he worked, occasionally pausing to take readings of the metallophage's expansion rate or to spray more deterrent foam in strategic locations. You know, he said to no one in particular as he fitted another panel into place, I think my thesis committee would have appreciated this kind of hands-on research methodology. Assuming they don't kill me for destroying millions of credits worth of equipment first. The shelter was taking shape, ugly, improvised, and somehow perfect for its hostile environment, just like its builder. You know what they never tell you in survival training, Ryker muttered, wrestling with a piece of pod circuitry. How to MacGyver a mass spectrometer out of emergency beacon parts, because you want to know if that thing that just tried to eat you is actually edible. The aliens watched as he cannibalized yet another essential piece of equipment for his latest project. I don't understand, Kr Thin said, manipulating the observation drone for a better view. He's destroying a perfectly good emergency beacon to create. What exactly? V.A. Zek's tentacles curled in appreciation. He's building tools to build better tools. Watch. Down on the surface, Ryker had managed to create a crude but functional analysis device using the beacon's sensors and his datapad's processing power. Now let's see what you're made of, he said, examining a sample from one of the smaller creatures he'd managed to trap, a six-legged thing that looked like a cross between a lobster and a solar panel. Fascinating. High protein content, minimal toxic compounds. Once you get past the naturally occurring battery acid in its digestive system, he made a note on his pad. I'll call it the voltaic crashlander. Note to self: work on better naming conventions. But the real breakthrough came when Ryker noticed something peculiar about the local plant life during an acid rain shower. Some species were actually thriving on the caustic precipitation, using chemical processes to break down the acid into useful compounds. The human is approaching the caustic fountain, NX Tally reported, referring to a particularly large specimen that seemed to function as a natural acid rain collector. Surely he's not going to. Oh, this is either brilliant or suicidal, Ryker said cheerfully, setting up a collection system using modified pod paneling and the plant's natural filtration process. Probably both. He had noticed that the plant processed the acid rain through a series of organic filters, eventually producing something remarkably close to pure water. He's using the planet's own defense mechanisms to survive, VA Zect observed, his scientific enthusiasm evident in the rapid movement of his appendages. The very things that make this world deadly to most species, he's turning into survival tools. The water collection system was just the beginning. Ryker had also discovered that the crystalline structures formed during the extreme temperature drops could be used as cutting tools, harder than diamond when properly processed. He used these to fashion more sophisticated implements, each one enabling him to create something even more complex. The beauty of bootstrap engineering, he commented, using his new tools to modify his suit's power system. Today's survival hack becomes tomorrow's foundation for something better. Like dating, but with less emotional trauma and more immediate physical danger. Perhaps the most impressive innovation came when Ryker figured out how to hunt. Rather than trying to outfight the deadly local wildlife, he used their own adaptations against them. He discovered that the voltaic crashlers were attracted to specific electromagnetic frequencies, the same ones emitted by the larger predator's sensory organs. If I modulate this signal just right, he adjusted his jerry-rigged transmitter, salvaged from the pod's communication array. A group of crashlers immediately changed direction, moving away from an approaching razor fiend. Dinner and a show. The alien observers were becoming increasingly agitated by their subjects' continued survival and innovation. This defies all known models of adaptation, Kr Thin insisted, his scientific worldview visibly crumbling. Species aren't supposed to be able to adjust this quickly to Class 13 environments. Perhaps VA Zeke mused, we need to revise our models. The human isn't just surviving, he's creating a sustainable system. Look at how each innovation builds on the last. Indeed, Ryker had established a remarkable little operation. The acid rain was now being collected and filtered through his engineered system, providing clean water. His modified analysis tools helped him identify safe food sources, while his electromagnetic lures kept larger predators at bay. He'd even figured out how to use the metallophage colonies as a sort of living fence, controlling their growth with carefully applied polymer barriers. Today's accomplishments. Ryker dictated to his datapad, now safely powered by a hybrid system of salvaged pod cells and adapted voltaic crashlander biobatteries, established reliable water source, secured sustainable food chain, and didn't get eaten by anything. Also, pretty sure I've revolutionized at least 3 fields of xenobiology. If the Institute doesn't accept these findings as my doctoral thesis, I'm going to be very disappointed. He paused, watching as a razor fiend tried to breach his perimeter, only to be repelled by the combined defenses he'd established. Though I suppose first I need to survive long enough to submit it. Note to self: being right about Class 13 worlds harboring beneficial adaptations is much less satisfying when experiencing them firsthand. From orbit, VA Zect made his own note: subject demonstrates unprecedented ability to not only survive but adapt and improve survival conditions using indigenous resources. Previous assumptions about Class 13 world habitability may require significant revision. In other words, NX Tally translated, humans are terrifying. No, VA Zect corrected, watching as Ryker began sketching plans for what appeared to be an even more elaborate filtration system. Humans are remarkable. There's a difference. Below, Ryker continued his work, unaware that his impromptu survival techniques were about to revolutionize galactic understanding of adaptation and habitability. He was too busy trying to figure out if he could domesticate a voltaic crashlander. For science, of course. The first warning came from the voltaic crashlers. Every single one of them suddenly ceased movement, their solar panel-like appendages rotating to face the same direction. Ryker, who'd learned to read the local wildlife like a particularly murderous weather forecast, immediately checked his cobbled-together atmospheric sensors. Well, that's not terrifying at all, he muttered, watching as the readings spiraled into ranges his equipment wasn't even designed to measure. Incoming storm with acid levels high enough to dissolve dreams, and temperatures swinging harder than a quantum pendulum. In orbit, the alien observation team's instruments were painting an even grimmer picture. "This is unprecedented," Kr Thin reported, his appendages twitching nervously. "The storm system appears to be a convergence of 3 separate atmospheric phenomena. The combined effect will create conditions that exceed even Mors Prima's usual hostility. The human cannot possibly survive this," NX Tally stated, her tone somewhere between concern and scientific detachment. "The shelter's current specifications won't withstand these conditions." VA Zect studied the readings, all 6 eyes narrowing. Should we intervene? Meanwhile, Ryker was having what he'd diplomatically call a significant research opportunity. "Okay," he muttered, watching as the violet sky began to turn an ominous shade of black. "What do we know about local survival strategies?" His eyes darted to the surrounding flora, which was already beginning to transform. The predatory plants were going into what appeared to be a defensive stance. The larger specimens were actually pulling smaller ones into their protective embrace, creating layered barriers against the coming storm. "Now that's interesting." Riker's eyes lit up with the kind of inspiration that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. "If they've evolved this behavior, it must work." Above, the debate continued. "Our directive is clear," Kr Thin insisted. "We observe only. We cannot interfere with natural survival scenarios." "There's nothing natural about this scenario," NX Tally countered. "The storm is beyond anything in our records." "Look," VA Zect interrupted, pointing at their main display. "He's doing something." That something was Ryker racing against time, using his knowledge of the local ecosystem in ways that made his observers question either his sanity or their own understanding of impossible. He'd noticed that the carnivorous vines, the ones that usually tried to snag anything that moved, were now wrapping themselves tightly around sturdy objects. Using his suit's remaining power reserves, he began generating electromagnetic pulses that mimicked the signals these plants used to communicate. "Come on, you gorgeous murder noodles," he coaxed, carefully manipulating the frequencies. "Let's be friends. Temporarily. Until we're not all dissolved into our component atoms." To the alien's astonishment, the vines responded. They began interweaving themselves through his shelter's framework, creating a living lattice of acid-resistant biological material. The human is hijacking the defensive mechanisms of predatory flora. Kr Thin's voice had risen to a pitch previously unknown to his species. "Not hijacking," VA Zect corrected, his tentacles writhing with excitement. "Cooperating. He's created a symbiotic relationship in minutes that should have taken millions of years to evolve." Ryker wasn't done. He'd observed how the metallophage colonies retreated during severe weather, forming protective shells of living metal. Using his polymer barriers, he herded several smaller colonies into strategic positions around his shelter's base, creating a living foundation that would actually strengthen under acid exposure. The storm was minutes away now. The temperature had already dropped enough to create crystalline formations on his suit's exterior. Above, the clouds churned like an angry sea of poisonous molasses. "I really hope this works," Ryker muttered, making his final adjustments. He'd created what he dubbed a biomechanical hybrid shelter, a structure that was part salvage technology, part living organism, and part mad science. Because Plan B is looking pretty thin. Actually, I don't have a Plan B. This was Plan B. Plan A was don't crash on a death world. The storm hit like the fist of an angry god who'd just discovered someone had stolen their parking spot. Acid rain fell in sheets thick enough to wade through. Temperature fluctuations created sounds like reality itself was cracking. The ground buckled and heaved as underground creatures sought deeper shelter. In orbit, the observation team watched in tense silence as their instruments struggled to maintain contact through the atmospheric interference. "Life signs are," NX Tally paused, adjusting her sensors. "Life signs are stable? How is that possible?" The shelter was holding. More than holding, it was adapting. The vines tightened and relaxed in response to pressure changes. The metallophage base shifted to redistribute weight. The entire structure moved like a living thing, bending rather than breaking. "Remarkable," VA Zect breathed. "He's turned the very elements that make this world deadly into a survival mechanism." Inside his creation, Ryker was taking readings with almost manic glee. "Note to self: current situation validates every crazy theory I've ever had about Class 13 world adaptation. Also, pretty sure I've just invented an entirely new field of architecture. assuming anyone believes this wasn't a hallucination brought on by acid rain exposure. As the storm raged outside, his shelter continued its impossible dance of survival, proving that sometimes the best way to survive hell is to make friends with the demons. Though next time he added to his notes, maybe start with smaller experimental parameters, like a Class 12 death world. Something nice and relaxing. The storm reached its apocalyptic crescendo with the subtlety of a supernova in a fireworks factory. Acid rain fell with such intensity that it was less precipitation and more like someone had turned the atmosphere into a blender filled with battery acid. Current external pH reading is Ryker squinted at his jury-rigged sensor display. Somewhere between instant molecular dissolution and why do you even want to know, good thing I'm not out there taking samples. He paused. Note to self, don't get any ideas about taking samples. In orbit, the alien observation team watched in fascination as their instruments recorded conditions that should have reduced any structure natural or artificial to its component atoms. The temperature differential is exceeding all previous records, Kr Thin reported, his voice tight with scientific anxiety. The structural stress should be tearing that shelter apart. But something unexpected was happening. The hybrid structure Ryker had created wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The living components had begun to exhibit properties that defied conventional biology. The predatory vines, NX Tally observed, adjusting her sensors in disbelief. They're not just resisting the acid, they're absorbing it and becoming stronger. Inside the shelter, Ryker watched in amazement as his readings confirmed what he was seeing. The plant matter had begun a rapid adaptation cycle, using the extreme conditions to evolve in real time. The metallophage colonies at the base were literally eating the acidic runoff, growing more resilient with each molecular meal. It's beautiful, Va Zek whispered, all 6 eyes wide. The human didn't just build a shelter. He created an adaptive ecosystem. A particularly violent temperature swing caused the ground to crack like breaking glass. The shelter swayed and then did something that made even Ryker pause in his note-taking. It moved. Not like a building shifting, but like a living organism adjusting its posture. Well, that's new, he commented, watching as his creation essentially rearranged itself to better distribute the structural load. I appear to have accidentally created architecture that can dance. The engineering department is going to have opinions about this. The storm's fury continued for 6 more hours, each moment bringing new impossibilities. The shelter's biological components continued to evolve, while its technological elements were gradually integrated into what was becoming less of a building and more of a living entity. Finally, as the apocalyptic conditions began to subside, a new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive hum of a rescue vessel's engines. This is the HSV determined intervention, a voice crackled through Ryker's salvage comm system. Dr. Zhou, do you copy? Perfect timing, Ryker responded cheerfully. Though you might want to hold off on the emergency extraction. I'm in the middle of something rather groundbreaking, literally in some cases. The rescue team's confusion was palpable. Doctor, our scans indicate you're in a Class 13 death world structure that's… Wait, our readings must be wrong. It appears to be partially alive. Oh good, your sensors are working perfectly then, Ryker replied, still taking readings of his shelter's ongoing evolution. You're just in time to witness the birth of an entirely new field of xenoarchitecture. Also, I'm going to need some more research equipment, and maybe a bigger grant. In orbit, the alien observation team had reached a conclusion that would reshape galactic understanding of both human capabilities and planetary classification. We must revise our entire approach to Class 13 world research, Va Zek declared. This human hasn't just survived, he's proven that these environments aren't just habitable, they're potential laboratories for evolutionary innovation. Assuming anyone believes our report, Kr Thin added dryly. A human crash lands on a death world, builds a living shelter out of predatory organisms, survives an impossible storm, and establishes a research base in under a week. It sounds like a fictional entertainment broadcast. Down on the surface, the rescue team had landed but was maintaining a safe distance from Ryker's creation, which had begun developing what appeared to be bioluminescent warning signals. Dr. Zhou, the rescue team leader, called out, "We really should evacuate you immediately." Evacuate. Ryker emerged from his shelter, his survival suit now decorated with patterns that suspiciously matched the surrounding flora's warning coloration. Do you realize what we've discovered here? This isn't just survival, it's a completely new paradigm for extreme environment adaptation. He gestured enthusiastically at his shelter, which had now developed what appeared to be rudimentary sensory organs. We've got self-evolving architecture, real-time biological adaptation, and I'm pretty sure my breakfast tried to solve differential equations yesterday. This isn't a disaster site anymore. It's the most advanced research station in the galaxy. The rescue team exchanged worried glances, clearly wondering if the extreme conditions had affected his sanity. But the data readings were undeniable. Somehow, this crazy human scientist had turned certain death into one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs in recent history. In their observation vessel, VA Zek made his final log entry concluding humans don't just survive impossible situations. They turn them into opportunities for innovation, recommendation, reconsider all previous assumptions about both environmental habitability and human capabilities. Additional note, perhaps we should be grateful they're generally peaceful. Peaceful but completely insane, NX Tally added, watching as Ryker began enthusiastically planning expansions to his living laboratory. No, VA Zek corrected, his tentacles waving in what might have been admiration. Just human. Which I'm beginning to think might be the most remarkable thing of all.